We're going to be getting into a part of my story, and this will happen probably quite a bit down through all of this, that will be likely considered controversial. And I know a lot of people are watching this that have followed me my whole career. You may find some things out about me that you didn't know, and I want there to be a disclaimer about all of this. Is that I'm not going to say anything in these videos for the sake of controversy or to invite discussion or debate or any of those things. It's not why I'm saying anything. And the only reason I have to talk about these things is because they are a massive part of the psychology of the story and a lot of what motivated me and all these people around me. So it's a little difficult to tell the story and kind of smooth over some of these issues. So this episode here will start to shed some light, I think, on some items. And I just, as I said before, I don't begrudge, anybody's their belief system or any of those things. That's not who I am. I don't care to change people's minds about things. It's not why I do anything. I'm just stating fact as I know it. So, and that's the operative word. I know it. It doesn't mean we all know what we know. And you can't take that away from anybody. Everybody, just like what my brother Dave laid on me, you can't see the world from someone else's consciousness. It's their own personal experience. And frankly, it's none of your business, because you're not forced to live inside somebody else's head or their life or their whatever. We should all just do what we do and get along with each other. That's the bottom line. My mother professed to be a Christian, a Baptist. And so I was exposed to, quasi-religion when I was a child. And of course, the bulk of what I heard about religion at that time was purely negative. My mother, as I think I said in a very early episode, my mother was ostracized in Shetty camp, in the 40s and 50s, for not being Catholic. And I believe I told the story that's why my mother and father and the children that were there at the time all left town, because the priest from the parish came and told my father, if you don't get that woman in my church and get her converted to Catholicism, you can get the F out of my town. And so my father said, well, fine, kiss my ass. And they left town. And my father, from that moment forward, basically hated religion and hated Catholics. And I never stepped foot into a church in my life, really, until I got to Alabama. Now, my mother, claiming to be an old Baptist, I'm an old Baptist. She prayed a lot, and referenced praying and referenced God and Jesus, and she taught me how to pray when I was a child. She taught me the Lord's Prayer, and she had a rather or I guess a rather Gnostic view of religion. Probably about the same as, parts of my, my knowledge on the subject now. She didn't believe in, she didn't seem to believe in organized religion. Like she would, when we see a televangelist come on TV, she'd laugh and just, call the guy an arsehole. And so I don't know. I'm not, strangely enough, it was, though she referenced it all the time and, used to thank God for this and that and was always praying. I used to hear her praying in the middle of the night. She was a prayerful person, but that's where it sort of ended. So at the time, I didn't see the hypocrisy in it. I was too young to understand that. I was thinking, okay, well, this woman is an alcoholic and a prescription drug addict, and she's a violent butthole and has tortured all her family and said horrible things to everybody, but yet she believes in God and expects Jesus to save her. And so it wasn't like I was blind to all of this. And of course, Brother Joe, who was avid reader, he brought a Bible into the house when I was a kid. He bought it and to read it, and not because we didn't go to church, but he brought the book in. I remember reading parts of it when I was a kid. I was an avid reader myself. As I said earlier in this series, my mother taught me to read when I was just a baby, and I was 4, 5, 6 years old. I could read the Bible and had understanding of it. Some of it was a little confusing because of the way it was written, the language of it, but it was part of my, it was a small part, I should say, of my upbringing. But when I landed in Alabama, the very first night, even that first gig, even though I was so just overwrought with excitement and the music and all these things, a lot of things I saw that first night didn't sink in right away. I was witnessing things in that church that were completely foreign to me. And but they went in my hopper and went in the back of my head moving forward the next day, And pretty soon I started to find out just how big a piece I had bitten off, not knowing I'd have to chew it. Because things were profoundly tied to religion, and not always in a good way either. Like, there was a lot of things I was about to learn that over the years I just floored me, and then after it was all over, I'd look back on it and just shake my head. One of the first things I started to learn immediately, immediately the next day, was the rules of the road for, basically the Pentecostal religion, and many of the other ones down there, all of the, whatever you want to call them, Southern Protestant religions, and they freaked me out. They just freaked me out. Women weren't allowed to wear makeup or pants or cut their hair ever. Men weren't allowed to have beards or grow their hair long. No one was allowed to wear jewelry. You couldn't smoke. You couldn't drink. You couldn't screw unless you were married. Couldn't swear. You couldn't, there was just, it was, coming from Canada, from a group of Cape Bretoners who all they did was drink, cuss, smoke, play, chase women, whatever the hell, like just live in a free-for-all. These people, on the surface, this is where the problem begins. On the surface, they appeared to be living pious, monk-like lifestyles. And, but immediately, as I was learning this stuff in the first few weeks of this odyssey, I was starting to notice that people were saying one thing and doing another. The first thing that hit me immediately, which I couldn't get my head around, again, you think you know shit when you're 17 years old, but you don't know anything. The first thing that hit me right off the bat was these people's disdain for black folks. And this would be a recurring thing all the way through the 10 years I was down there. And that didn't compute to me. On one side of the coin, they're loving, accepting of all God's children, but at the same time, was nothing to hear one of them call a black person the N-word. It was nothing to them. It's like, oh, that's just some N-word, whatever. And I used to just cringe every time I heard it. I never got used to it. And that was one thing. And then more things were revealed to me, as time went on. And mind you, the one saving grace through this whole chapter was the music. The music never failed. The music was just always there, and I was continually learning and creating and inventing and hearing things, little things, that I couldn't hear anywhere else. There were all these intricacies and, musical innuendo going on with these people and these players I was around. That was the saving grace. That was the thing that was the trade-off, let's say, as I moved forward and started to learn more and more about how actually dark this situation was with this set of people, The first thing I started to notice, the first thing I started to crave was a way out of this. I was looking around there was a fanaticism in these people in this religion that was terrifying, frankly. And I immediately started to get told I'd have to be, born again and accept Christ and all this other stuff, and I was like, what the is going on here? Like, what's going on here? And it seemed completely unrelated to music, which is the reason I was there. I started to find out that, while these people were preaching the gospel and singing 100%, secular gospel music, no secular music whatsoever, and taking 100% of their income from churches, That was the next thing I realized, is that these people were not signing contracts or doing like anything like that. They were going literally from church to church. When they weren't playing a bluegrass festival, that was a different story. They'd get paid for that, an agreed amount. But the bulk of their work was traveling all over the southern United States from church to church, depending 100% on the collection plate. Okay, so then I clued in. I was like, okay, this is it's a scam. That's what's going on, and I thought, okay, that's interesting, because I started to notice that Enoch, for one, whilst he was one of the most charismatic frontmen for a band I'd ever seen, and he would quote these, Bible verses and things that he said every single night, that he did them every night sometimes. And he said them so quickly and so succinctly, and he'd turn a whole sentence into a single word, like it's just, and when he'd do that, the audience would kind of, I started to see that even though he was doing that, what he really wanted was to play bluegrass. Like he modeled his band after Bill Monroe. That was his. He wanted that more than anything, and he wanted recognition from Monroe, which he got. Bill Monroe called them the first family of bluegrass music, and they earned it. They deserved it. It was a tremendously good band. But the bottom line was, Enoch, when you really looked at him, he did two things. He was a cattle farmer. He loved the cows more than anything else. And what he was really after was to play super hot bluegrass music. That's what he wanted. The religion, it became clear to me very quickly that the religion part of this was only a vehicle for him, and he had got locked into something he didn't mean to get locked into, which was marrying Margie Brewster. Right? He married Margie in the 40s. I imagine they met at a religious event, some kind of preaching, or a roadside, a brush arbor at the side of the road, as they say, where they used to have these all-day preachings and dinner on the ground, and that whole southern thing, right? Like, and she already was very famous as a singer, and they hooked up and fell in love, got married, and, well, maybe they did. I don't know if they fell in love or not. It's hard to say, really, when you look at it. But it's in my opinion, looking back on all this now, it was a marriage of convenience. She was a tremendous vocalist, and a great songwriter, as was he. She gave him credibility within the Pentecostal and the religious world in general. And they built upon that, like right away, starting, and here's where things, where things start to turn for me, as I started to find out what their history was and who they were. And it made me love some of them more and others not so much, They started out in 1949 as a group. And the group was Enoch, okay, Margie, and then Enoch's brother Emmett on the banjo, and Enoch's uncle, Jerry Sullivan, who was Enoch's father's brother. Now, before Enoch met Margie, the boys traveled with their dad, Arthur, and he was a traveling preacher and a famous one, and they sang and played and whatnot. And Arthur died, literally, they used to say that Enoch told the story every night how his father died at the pulpit. You know, we followed our father, our daddy. And he wrote a song called Sing a Song for Daddy, which was a brilliant song. It was an awesome song. And they tell the story. Oh, my daddy, he preached to the very end. He preached a wonderful sermon, closed the Bible, and turned away from the pulpit and suffered the heart attack that took his life. And that was his line. He died. He did. He died right in the stage in the church, right on the church, right on the floor, dropped dead. So, like, there was all this history, and it was almost like a competing history, that Enoch's family history was more important than Margie's, and blah, blah, blah. Like, there was all this lineage and pedigree and sort of a jealousy almost in amongst all these people. So the band started out 100% family. It was Enoch, his uncle Jerry, his brother Emmett, and his wife Marge. And I believe they had, at the time, they may have had a great mandolin player named James Phillips was with them from the very beginning, or close to it. And so in 1949, they got a weekly radio show in Picayune, Mississippi. And they started recording, and their records started getting played all over the South. And it really exploded. They were very, very unique. The first family of bluegrass gospel music, right? Like, that was their moniker and their branding, helped along by Monroe. Bill Monroe kind of started it for them, you know, and got them going in the 60s. But up until that time, they had built all this on their own. And it was very, very impressive. They were an incredibly good band, like, hard to beat, you know. And so by the 60s, they had moved, you know, away from, they still did radio and toured all over the place, but then they got big enough that they got a weekly television show that was filmed out of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And although it was regional, but it went all over the South. It went from basically, you know, Arizona to Kentucky, all over the South, in color. I think it was 65 or 4. I don't know. Remember whenever color TV started, and they had a weekly television show, and it was awesome. It was really an awesome program. I've seen video of it, and they had guests on. They had Carl Story. They had Marty Stewart on there for the first time. He was only 13 years old. Started playing with them. They had Carl Jackson, one of the world's greatest banjo players, who went on to work for Glenn Campbell and then owned all kinds of major publishing houses in Nashville, and just did so many great things. One of the greatest songwriters ever in Nashville. He made hits for everybody, Carl did. And so there they were, you know, like, they had this incredible thing going. Now there was some hiccups along the way. In 1960, Enoch this was another thing that he used on stage, his testimony, right? But it was so polished and so slick, you know. And in 1960, I was diagnosed with the second most deadly form of cancer known to man, you know. And he'd tell the story, and he had this massive scar on his side where they removed something. He didn't really told me what it was. He didn't like to talk about it. I don't think it was a very good experience. And he almost died. And they saved him. They said he was a dead man. They told him he was a dead man. And they cut the cancer out and gave him massive radiation. And in those days, I don't even know if they had chemo. But instead of his hair falling out, it went snow white. That's what the treatment did to him. And because I asked him one time, he was a young man when I met him. Well, he was in his 50s, I guess. late 50s. And so his hair went white. He didn't really talk about that on stage, but that's what he said. My hair went white overnight in the hospital. And so that was a rather frightening hiccup that he lived through. But then he monetized it. He said he turned it into a shtick, right, about how God saved him, and he turned away from the devil that at that moment for good, and was only going to work for God, and blah blah blah, right? So that was all good. But you know, from behind him, watching him and seeing him off the stage at home, and you know, even anywhere, you knew it was all bullshit. It was a shtick. It was him pandering to the audience, you know, the congregation, so that he'd have something profound to say about his own personal religious experience. So, fine and good. They're going along very successfully. They're touring they have their own bus. They're touring in buses, cars, whatever and they ended up, they had a station wagon that they toured him, and they couldn't afford to run the bus, basically. And one night, they were coming home from a gig on the interstate. And on the other side of the interstate, there was a gentleman hauling a race car, like a NASCAR-style race car, on a flatbed trailer. It wasn't secured, and he hydroplaned on the other side of the road, other side of the divided highway, and the trailer, he sort of jackknifed the trailer somehow, and the race car, this guy was traveling probably at 75 miles an hour on the other side of the road. The race car flew off the trailer into the median, launched into the air coming out of the median, and from, 10 or 15 feet above the Sullivans, this car came out of the blackness, out of the air, and hit them head on. And they were doing 60, 75 miles an hour. So their resulting injuries were just absolutely catastrophic. None of them died. It was Enoch and Margie in the front seat and Emmett and Jerry in the back seat. So Enoch was crushed, broken sternum, broken everything. The station wagon's engine ended up on top of Margie. She was in the floorboards with the engine on top of her, and it smashed her face all in. Lost all her teeth. Half of her face got blown off. And Emmett hit the front seat so hard that he broke his back. And Jerry flew over Enoch and hit the sun visor right across the top of his forehead, and it split his skull open. And so Emmett, another reason Emmett was my hero, Emmett, severely injured, gets out of this wreckage and pulls everybody out of the car, which is on fire. He lifts the engine, and this is not beyond, his abilities. I've seen him do it myself with my own eyes later on. He picked the engine off of Margie. He pulled the engine off of her. And he probably had that, that accident adrenaline strength as well, but he was a strong man. I saw him lift an engine block myself before, later on, when I came into the story. Pulled the engine off her, got her out, ripped the side of the car out, got Enoch out, pulled Jerry out, and thought he was dead because he saw the injury, and he says no, and Jerry was barely breathing. And so he laid Jerry on the side of the road in the gravel. There was a big pile of gravel, it was covered in gravel, and It was the middle of the night, and he laid Jerry out there. So there they were, waiting for ambulances and all this stuff. Now, what they didn't know was the reason Jerry wasn't breathing too well was because, well, he had a tremendously severe head trauma, obviously, and he had hit the impact. He hit so hard that his internal organs shifted up into his chest. That was how hard he impacted, the front of the car when he went over the seat head first. And he wasn't breathing because his intestines and everything were up underneath his diaphragm. And he was unconscious, of course, from this massive wound in his head and bleeding out. And when the ambulance people arrived, they went over and looked at him, and the driver, one of the paramedics, he went over to look at Jerry, and he saw Jerry's head, and he looked. The moon was out, and there was so much gravel and debris all around Jerry's head. He thought that it was Jerry's brains out on the ground. So he didn't even check Jerry. They thought Jerry was already dead. So eventually, Emmett went back over, I think, is how it went, and he checked Jerry again, and he was alive. And so he yelled over to the paramedics, "You got to help my Uncle Jug," they called him, Uncle Jug. Jug Handle. And we'll get into that later, how he got that nickname. So they got everybody in the ambulances and got them to the hospital. So there was a massive period of recovery. A couple of years it took them to, like, Margie had to learn how to walk again, and they had to reconstruct her face, and it was just a mess. It was a terrible, terrible accident. One that, it's just amazing that they survived it. It is a miracle that they survived it. The chances of surviving something like that is just 1,000,000,000 to 1. So here's where things take the darkest turn of all. And this one event would not only shape all of their lives, but mine as well, because I and a lot of other people like me who worked for the Sullivan family were caught in the middle of this. Just by virtue of being there, we got caught in the middle of the aftermath of this accident, and I'm going to explain to you what that is. And another reason why the more I learned about who they were and what they had done and what they were doing, just caused me to further discount, their religious professions and religion in a general sense, really. During this recovery period, Margie, it wasn't Enoch or Emmett, or Jerry, it was Margie who went on the warpath and decided that she, this was in the 60s. It was, or late 60s probably, and I don't think there was a lot of this kind of, ambulance chasing, personal injury lawsuit sort of things. Hadn't really taken off yet, I don't believe, in those days as much as it is now. But she went on the warpath and found a lawyer out of Mobile, I believe, who was an absolute killer. And she decided that she was going to sue the owner of the race car, which he had every right to do, because there was negligence on his part, because he hadn't tied the car down properly onto this trailer, and that was proven in court. But here's where things take a real dark turn. She decided that she was going to sue this person on her own. she didn't include Emmett or Jerry in this lawsuit. So, like, that's ugly. Because Emmett and Jerry were both severely injured. And the way that she set it up was she sued this guy on her behalf, and she was married to Enoch. So if she succeeded in the lawsuit, Enoch would succeed as well by the virtue of being married to her. But the way she set it up was if Emmett and Jerry wanted to get anything out of this lawsuit or anything out of anybody, they would be forced to sue Enoch because he was driving. I don't know how she managed to get that done, but that's what happened. She shut everybody in the car out of the lawsuit but herself. That level of greed and, frankly, just evil is... there's no words for that. That level of just self-centeredness, that's a hateful human being. And by all accounts, she was not the nicest person. And she wanted to be in control, and she wanted to have everybody's balls in her purse. And this was her way of getting it done financially. And so that's what happened. She sued this guy, and she won a huge amount of money. And I'm not sure what that number was, but I heard everything from $250,000 to a full $1 million she won in this lawsuit. But she didn't give any of it to anybody, not even Enoch. She banked it. And Emmett and Jerry were left out in the cold. I think at some point in time, Enoch helped Emmett, sort of clandestinely. Somehow, he got Emmett a little bit of money, a very little bit of money, to help him recover. But they just simply abandoned Jerry. They just abandoned him. And so here's Jerry coming back from, years of recovery, coming back from this horrible head trauma, which if you've ever known anybody who's suffered a severe head injury, they're never the same. Your life's never the same. He was trauma. He dealt with the aftermath of that injury for the rest of his life. It never went away. And when he finally came to, months later, and realized what was going on, he was like, "Wait a second. How are we supposed to, get help?" And Margie just told him, "Well, tough tit. If you want to sue somebody, you're going to have to sue Enoch." And she knew he wouldn't sue Enoch. He loved Enoch. That was his nephew, right? And he loved Emmett. He wasn't going to sue his own family. And so that's how it got. That's where things fell apart with the whole deal. And it fell apart in a spectacular way because Jerry, didn't take kindly to what was done to him. And it created a massive rift between Jerry and Enoch and Margie. Emmett, not so much. Emmett was on Jerry's side, but didn't speak of it openly. But part of Enoch's, part of the feud was Enoch standing, beside Margie because she had the money. So he couldn't go against her. So part of his hatred for Jerry was a fraud. He didn't hate Jerry. He just didn't want to lose his money and his wife. So And and Jerry knew that, and that made Jerry even angrier. That Enoch just deserted him over money and left, and they left Jerry penniless. He couldn't work anymore. He couldn't play. He could barely function. He was years, coming out of this accident. And so that was the background and the temperature within this family unit that I inadvertently blundered into, just wanting to learn how to play better music, which I ended up doing. I was still able to, extract what I wanted to out of them musically and forge some really good relationships with some of them. I was never close to Margie because I always suspected there was something a little bit dark about her, and there was. I loved Enoch, but he couldn't trust him because that was his nature. He was going to do what was good for him in the long run, and that was it. And Emmett was salt of the earth. Emmett was the one guy through the whole thing that pretty well exemplified, what you should be as a human being. And he didn't believe in this. He just didn't believe in all this religion thing. You just knew it. He didn't. I don't know what he believed, but he certainly wasn't. He used to laugh at these people in this congregation, these places we'd go, and they'd be rolling around the aisles and speaking in tongues and running around the church, and Emmett he'd egg them on just so he could giggle at them after. That was who he was, right? He just laughed at everything. But there was one thing underlying all of this was the music. There was parts of the music and parts of the musical vocabulary that you just couldn't deny. Some of it was over the top, right? Like some of it was just purely, just designed to, I don't know. It wasn't profound. It was just, things, directly out of the Bible that were, they were preaching tools, right? But then from time to time you'd come across a song that they would do that was filled with hope. And I never saw the danger, and I never saw the damage or the danger in that. That was a good thing when you can look at a piece of music or hear a song, hear this poetry, right? That gives you hope that whether there's anything after this life or not, it's important sometimes for that sort of an idea to be brought to you for one simple reason. It makes you think that you should be acting better as a person, and it's you hear a song and the message is so beautiful. This idea that, maybe someday we might meet all these people again that we've lost. And if you act right, if you treat people well and you do good in your life and you don't be a butthole, you might just be able to be there, and that's a good hope. It doesn't matter whether or not it's true or provable or any of those things. And I always looked at some of those songs, some of the poetry, some of the beauty of it, and thought, there's nothing wrong with this. This is a message. Even if it turns out to not be true, it doesn't matter. It's the hope. It's the the positivity and the hope of it that could cause people to just smarten up. Treat your neighbor like your brother. Treat a stranger like your brother or your sister. And that was my biggest problem with most of the religious angles that were going on down there because many people didn't treat each other like that. And for one thing, I mean, just skin color became a barrier. So how can you, how can you expect to receive these things that religion teaches you if you can't even overlook somebody's skin color and you're holding that against them? So that was always my hope, and when sometimes I'd listen to these songs and sing them and stuff, and even wrote my own, in the hopes that people would just, even if they didn't believe anything, even if they just took away something that would make them think, I should try to be a better person. That's what that gives me. That song gives me a possibility, however scant it may be, that if I smarten up and do the right thing by everyone, that there may be a reward at the end of this. And if there isn't, you won't know it anyway. So there's not a lot of harm in that if that's what the byproduct of it is. And that's what it should be. And I'm probably going to get into this a lot more as these episodes go forward, because because of being in the middle of that kind of religious quagmire, me, the historian and the reader and the Mr. Curious, Iron Balls McGee, I started studying this stuff, strong, hard, actual historic things, not just the Bible, but I started to ask questions. And I still go back to that, though. Like I look at this, the things that I saw and the way certain things moved people, that there's a great deal of hope in some of this music. And I've kept a lot of it in my repertoire. And there was one song, actually, that the first song I ever heard the Sullivans sing on stage when I met them at Wiggins, Mississippi. It was called "Stairway to Heaven," not the Led Zeppelin, not the Zeppelin song, but or was it Led Zeppelin? Yeah, it was Led Zeppelin, I think. Jesus, I don't know. Anyhow, I'm having a brain fart again this morning, but it was called "Stairway to Heaven." It was written by a guy up in Nashville, and was one of the most beautiful songs I ever heard, and it was just all about that grand possibility, that if you do right, there's a possibility that you may go somewhere after this is over and see all your loved ones again, which is a grand thought, and like I said, if it's not true, well, you won't know it. So there's no harm in it, not in my opinion. As long as you don't, as long as that's all it is. I know that for me personally, part of the reason it appealed to me, that premise, was my dad. I thought, that would be kind of cool if that was true. And it's easy to feel that way too when you've lost people in your life. That it's the problem I have with it is when people cling to it. They cling to it, and then they really just live their lives based upon that in a negative way, or they try to force other people to believe what they believe, and that's not possible, because, as I said in the last episode, we're all individuals. We can only experience the cosmos through our own consciousness. There's no way to live in somebody else's head. And frankly, it's not fair to push ideas on people that they don't find out for themselves, because you're taking away a huge part of their potential makeup. People should come to their belief systems, I guess, on their own. And I had a great conversation with Tom Connors one night. And it was all about belief. And it sums up pretty well my feelings on the subject. Tom told me, he says, I don't believe in anything. Because belief requires you to, the word belief, that you believe in something, indicates that what you're talking about, the item you're talking about, may be false or not exist at all. You can only know. That's it. There's no belief. There's no faith. There's no anything. It's what you know. If that's all that's real. And if you believe in something, you could be putting your eggs in a basket that's empty and will always be empty. And that's why I've always equated all these things, about religion, away from belief and faith and all these things, and just called it hope. Because it is a hope. You never, secretly, even the most staunch atheist, probably in the back of his mind goes, well, it would be cool if we just didn't end here. It would be pretty cool if we got to see. And you never know. Scientifically, there's a possibility we do go on because of the nature of what we are. But like I said, nobody can come back and tell you, so it is what it is. So it just leaves one thing: hope. And hopefully, no pun intended, that hope would cause people to be better humans, better to each other and better to ourselves, and more forgiving of ourselves and other people. And that's what the music did for me back then. That's how it made me feel, and still does to this day. So, yeah, I guess I can pretty easily chalk up my religious leanings fairly simply into just saying that there really isn't any leanings. There's just my hope, and my hope for people more than anything. Just my hope for people. And the way things are today, you look at the date on this video, and when you look back at this conversation that we're having today, you'll be able to see, how rough things are with the human species. And hopefully someday we can look back at these stories and other stories and go, wow, we came a long way from that. Now we're doing better. And that's all we can hope for. Have you dreamed of the stairway to heaven? A home just beyond the blue. Stairway of gold to God's heavenly fold. The stairway that's waiting for you. There's a stairway to heaven that leads to that home bright and fair. Step by step we'll climb till his hand touches mine. Then I'll rest at the top of the stairs. There's a stairway that leads up to heaven, that others before us have trod. They've gone to that place that Jesus prepared at the foot of the throne of God. There's a stairway to heaven that leads to that home bright and fair. Step by step I'll climb till his hand touches mine. Then I'll rest at the top of the stairs. There's a place at the top of the stairway where we'll rest when we're all safely there. And friends that we leave someday we shall greet in our home at the top of the stairs. There's a stairway, stairway to heaven that leads to that home bright and fair. Step by step I'll climb till his hand touches mine. Then I'll rest at the top of the stairs. Step by step I'll climb till his hand touches mine. Then I'll rest at the top of the stairs.